A 9-year-old girl followed a reformed ex-gang member down a dusty Phoenix street, clutching a faded piece of paper with a mysterious code that would either save her family's home or destroy everything they had left. When he saw what she carried, this hardened man broke down in tears, realizing he owed a debt that was 23 years overdue, hit like if you believe in second chances. Subscribe for more incredible true stories, and comment what city you're watching from right now. Camila Ortiz climbed the suffocating stairwell of the Phoenix apartment building, the smell of grease and cold coffee clinging to her diner uniform like a second skin. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the cracked linoleum as she reached the 3rd floor, keys already in hand. But the door to apartment 3B stood wide open. Inside her living room, men in pressed suits moved with clinical precision. A realtor with perfectly styled blonde hair measured the cramped space while speaking into her phone, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. 2 other men photographed everything: the water stain on the ceiling, the secondhand furniture, even Maya's small pile of schoolbooks on the kitchen table. "Excuse me?" Camila's voice cracked. "This is my home." The realtor ended her call with a sharp tap of her manicured nail. "Ms. Ortiz, we represent the new owner, Nolan Pierce. You've been occupying this unit without proper authorization." The words hit Camila like ice water. Her fingers tightened around her purse strap as one of the men thrust a stack of official-looking documents toward her. The pages blurred as she tried to read, her heart hammering against her ribs. There must be some mistake. No mistake. The realtor's smile was arctic. "Mr. Pierce acquired this property through proper channels. We're conducting a preliminary assessment before beginning the transition process." From the doorway of her bedroom, 9-year-old Maya appeared, clutching the frayed straps of her school backpack. Her dark eyes, too wide for her small face, darted between her mother and the strangers who had invaded their sanctuary. She pressed herself against the doorframe, watching every movement with the hypervigilance of a child who had learned too young that safety could evaporate without warning. "Mama," Maya's whisper barely carried across the room. Camila forced her trembling lips into a smile. "It's okay, mija. Just some visitors." The realtor's gaze shifted to Maya with calculating coldness. "Of course we understand this situation might be emotionally challenging for families, especially single mothers." She paused, letting the words settle like poison. "We certainly wouldn't want any unnecessary complications that might require involvement from social services. Children need stability, after all." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but crystal clear. Camila's breath caught in her throat. Her knees felt weak as she gripped the back of their secondhand couch, the fabric rough beneath her palms. In the hallway, Mrs. Garcia from 3A hurried past with her eyes fixed on the floor, her grocery bags rustling. Old Mr. Santos paused at the top of the stairs, his weathered face creasing with concern. But one sharp look from the suited men sent him shuffling away. The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed like judgment down the narrow corridor. "When do we need to?" Camila couldn't finish the sentence. "We'll be in touch with specific timelines." The realtor snapped her phone shut with finality. "Have a lovely evening, Mrs. Ortiz." They filed out with the same cold efficiency they'd entered with, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and the violation of strangers' hands on everything Camila and Maya called home. The door clicked shut, and suddenly the small apartment felt impossibly larger and more fragile. As if the walls themselves had been compromised, Maya remained frozen in the bedroom doorway, her small fingers white-knuckled around her backpack straps. The late afternoon sun slanted through their single window, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward them like grasping fingers. Camila sank onto the couch, her work shoes slipping off her aching feet. She stared at the documents scattered on the coffee table. Legal terminology she couldn't understand, signatures that weren't hers, dates that made no sense. Her hands shook as she tried to organize the papers, but the words swam before her eyes. "Mama," Maya took a tentative step forward. "Are we in trouble?" Camila looked up at her daughter, her beautiful, brave daughter who had already witnessed too much uncertainty in her 9 short years. Maya's school uniform was slightly wrinkled, her dark hair escaping from its morning ponytail, but her eyes held the same fierce protectiveness that reminded Camila so much of Diego. "No, baby." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "We're not in trouble. Mama's going to figure this out." But even as she spoke the words, Camila felt the ground shifting beneath them, outside their window. Phoenix stretched endlessly under the desert sun, and somewhere in that vast city lived people with power and money, who saw her family as nothing more than an obstacle to remove. Maya nodded slowly. But she didn't move from the doorway. Instead, she stood guard like a tiny sentinel, her backpack still clutched to her chest, ready to run if the strangers came back. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears and the weight of an uncertain future that had just crashed through their door uninvited. The oscillating fan in their bedroom fought a losing battle against the Phoenix heat, its rhythmic clicking the only sound competing with distant sirens that sliced through the thick night air. Camila lay staring at the water-stained ceiling, her uniform draped over the single chair, still carrying the ghost of French fry grease and disappointment. At 2 a.m., she finally surrendered to insomnia. The old metal box lived behind her winter coats in the tiny closet, coats that seemed absurd in the desert, but were all she'd managed to bring from Chicago years ago. Her fingers traced the rusted edges as she lifted it onto the kitchen table, the overhead bulb casting harsh shadows that made everything look more desperate than it was. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with time, lay the fragments of a life she'd tried to forget. A photograph of Diego, his smile young and reckless, his arm thrown around her shoulders outside a taco truck that no longer existed. The saint pendant, San Judas, patron of lost causes, that he'd pressed into her palm the day Maya was born. For protection, he'd whispered, his eyes already holding the weight of secrets she was better off not knowing. And beneath it all, a scrap of notebook paper, creased and soft from countless folds, in Diego's careful handwriting, a phone number, and 2 words that made her chest tighten. Lobo 27. The paper trembled between her fingers as memories flooded back. Diego's nervous energy the last time she'd seen him, the way he'd glanced over his shoulder even in their own apartment. He'd told her about Elias then, how he'd helped a man who'd been falsely accused, how he'd vouched for him at the auto shop when no one else would give an ex-gang member a chance. If something ever happens to me, Diego had said, folding the paper small enough to hide in her jewelry box, and you or Maya need help, real help, find this man. Tell him Diego sent you. He'll remember the debt. She'd never imagined she'd need to remember those words. Maya appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Mama, why are you awake? Couldn't sleep, mija. Camila quickly closed the box, but not before Maya's sharp eyes caught the glint of the pendant. Is that Papa's? Maya moved closer, her small feet silent on the linoleum. Camila nodded, lifting the silver chain. The pendant caught the light. San Judas's image worn smooth from years of Diego's nervous touch. He wanted you to have it when you were older. Maya reached out with reverent fingers. Papa said San Judas helps when things seem impossible. Yes, baby. When there's nowhere else to turn. They sat together in the pre-dawn quiet, the weight of the pendant warm between Camila's palms. Through their thin walls, they could hear Mrs. Garcia's television murmuring in Spanish, the comforting cadence of late-night novelas that promised happy endings for the deserving. Mama. Maya's voice was small in the darkness. Those men today, they can't really take our home, can they? Camila wanted to lie again, to wrap her daughter in false comfort until morning made everything seem possible. But Maya deserved better than illusions. I don't know, mija, but I'm going to try everything I can to stop them. Maya studied her mother's face with those 2 wise eyes. What if we need help? Like Papa said. The paper seemed to burn through the metal box. Camila looked at her daughter, this brave little girl who'd already lost her father to violence she didn't understand, who now faced losing the only home she'd ever known. The pendant swayed between them like a compass pointing toward a choice Camila wasn't sure she was brave enough to make. Then we'll ask for it, she whispered. Outside their window, Phoenix began its slow awakening. Coffee shops flickered to life. Early shift workers headed to warehouses and hotels. And somewhere in the sprawling city, a man named Elias Navarro was probably getting ready for another day of honest work, unaware that his past was about to knock on his door in the form of a 9-year-old girl carrying her father's faith in impossibilities. Maya curled against her mother's side, the pendant clasped in her small fist. Will you tell me about Papa and the man he helped? And in the quiet hour before dawn, with the threat of tomorrow hanging over them like summer heat, Camila began to speak. The next afternoon arrived with the relentless weight of Phoenix sun, and the realtor's BMW pulling up to the curb like a bad omen. Maya watched from behind their thin curtains as the blonde woman emerged, her heels clicking against the sidewalk with mechanical precision. This time, she wasn't alone. A security guard flanked her. Not police, but close enough to make every resident of the building sink deeper into their apartments. Maya heard doors clicking shut down the hallway, the soft scratch of chain locks being engaged. The building held its breath. When the realtor knocked, Camilla's hands were already shaking. She opened the door to find the woman's smile had grown sharper, more predatory. "Ms. Ortiz, I trust you've had time to review the documentation. I don't understand most of it," Camila admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's unfortunate, but not our responsibility. We'll need you to begin packing immediately." The realtor's gaze swept the apartment, like she was cataloging every possession for removal. "The transition timeline has been accelerated." Maya stepped forward before her mother could stop her. "This is our home." The realtor's attention shifted to the child with cold calculation. "Sweetie, I'm sure this is confusing for you, but sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions about what's best for children. Stability matters so much more than attachment to places." The threat was velvet-wrapped but unmistakable. Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach as her mother's face went pale. After they left, Camila disappeared into the bathroom. Maya heard the muffled sound of crying through the thin door, the kind of desperate, quiet sobs meant to be hidden from children who had already seen too much. While her mother got ready for her evening shift at the diner, Maya made a decision that would have terrified any reasonable adult. She slipped the folded paper and the San Judas pendant into her backpack, alongside her math homework and a granola bar that had seen better days. At the diner, she sat in the back booth doing homework while her mother served coffee and listened to conversations that might contain clues. That's when she heard two construction workers talking about a mechanic in the Latino neighborhood who did good work cheap. "Elias something," one said. "Quiet guy? Runs that little shop on Calle Estrella." Maya memorized the street name. The walk across Phoenix in the late afternoon heat was longer than she'd expected. Her sneakers, already worn thin, felt every crack in the sidewalk as she made her way through neighborhoods that gradually shifted from generic apartment complexes to vibrant murals and hand-painted signs in Spanish. The smells changed too. Exhaust and hot concrete giving way to fresh tortillas, automotive oil, and the green scent of someone's carefully tended garden surviving against the desert odds. Music spilled from open windows, accordion and guitar mixing with the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. Calle Estrella was exactly what she'd hoped for, and nothing like she'd expected. The auto shop squatted between a market with beautiful hand-lettered signs and a beauty salon where elderly women sat under ancient dryers. Their conversations a comfortable murmur in the afternoon heat. Through the open bay door, Maya could see a man in coveralls bent over an engine, his movements sure and economical. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray at the temples, and grease marked his forearms like temporary tattoos. When he straightened to wipe his hands on a red shop rag, she caught a glimpse of old ink disappearing beneath his collar, the kind of tattoos that told stories she was too young to understand. This had to be him. Maya waited across the street, her heart hammering as he finished with the car and began closing up the shop. When he finally locked the front door and started walking down the sidewalk, she forced herself to follow. The late afternoon sun painted everything golden, softening the edges of her fear. She matched her steps to his, staying half a block behind, past murals of saints and soccer players, past children playing in the spray of an open fire hydrant. Her backpack felt impossibly heavy with the weight of hope and desperation. At a corner where mariachi music drifted from a restaurant's open windows, she finally found her courage. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice smaller than she'd intended. Elias turned, surprise flickering across his weathered face when he saw her. Up close, she could see that his eyes were kind but careful, the eyes of someone who'd learned to read situations quickly. "You okay, kid? You lost." Maya's hand closed around the pendant in her pocket. "Are you Elias? Elias Navarro?" The question seemed to hang in the desert air like heat shimmer. His expression shifted. Not unkind, but suddenly alert, in a way that made her think of her father. "Who's asking?" With trembling fingers, Maya pulled out the folded paper. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. The old phone number, and below it, in her father's careful handwriting, Lobo 27. Elias went very still. The sounds of the street, children laughing, cars passing, the distant thrum of air conditioners working overtime, seemed to fade as his eyes fixed on the paper in her small hands. "Where did you get this?" "My papa left it for me," he said. "He said if we ever needed help, I should find you." Maya's voice cracked on the words. "He said you'd remember." The paper shook in Elias's calloused hands as the street sounds of Phoenix seemed to recede into memory. 23 years collapsed into nothing. He was 18 again, sitting in a holding cell, falsely accused of a robbery he'd been nowhere near, the kind of setup that would have sent him away for decades. destroying any chance at the life he was just beginning to imagine beyond gang colors and territory wars. Diego Ortiz had been a mechanic then, too, working at the garage where Elias had hung around, hoping for day work and staying out of trouble. When the police came looking for someone to blame, Diego had stepped forward with an alibi and a job offer, vouching for a kid he barely knew, putting his own reputation on the line. "Your papa," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion he thought he'd buried. "Diego," Maya nodded, tears already gathering in her eyes. "He died when I was 6. Mama says he was trying to help somebody, but something went wrong." The pendant caught the late afternoon sun as Maya pulled it from beneath her t-shirt. San Judas, patron saint of lost causes. The same medal Diego had worn every day, the one he'd pressed into Elias's palm the morning he'd started work at the garage. "He told you about me." "Not much, just that you were good people who got a bad start, and that if anything happened to him," Maya's voice wavered, "if me and Mama ever really needed help, we should find Lobo 27. The old street name hit Elias like a physical blow. He hadn't heard it in over 2 decades, not since the day he'd walked away from everything he'd known, choosing Diego's offered hand over the familiar comfort of colors and codes. His past was supposed to be dead and buried, marked only by the faded tattoos he kept hidden beneath long sleeves even in Phoenix heat. "What kind of help do you need, mija?" Maya's explanation came in breathless bursts. Men in suits, legal papers they couldn't understand, threats wrapped in reasonable voices, the growing certainty that she and her mother would lose the only home she'd ever known. Her small hands gestured as she spoke, trying to make him understand the scope of their helplessness. "They said if Mama makes trouble, they'll call social services. They'll say she can't take care of me properly." Maya's voice dropped to a whisper. "I can't lose her too. She's all I have left." Elias knelt down to her level, his work boots scraping against the sidewalk. This close, he could see Diego in the set of her chin, the fierce determination in her dark eyes. She was terrified but hadn't run. Just like her father, she was fighting a battle bigger than herself. "What's your mama's name?" Camila Ortiz." Another memory surfaced. Diego talking about his girl, how she was studying to be a nurse, how they were going to get married and move somewhere safe. Life had clearly taken different turns than Diego had planned. "Does she know you came looking for me?" Maya shook her head. "She's scared to ask anyone for help. She says we can't trust people we don't know, and everyone we did know is gone." The irony wasn't lost on Elias. This child had violated every safety rule her mother had taught her, walking across Phoenix alone to find a stranger whose only credential was a faded note and a dead man's recommendation. But Diego had been right. Elias did owe a debt, one that had been earning interest for 23 years. "I need to make some phone calls," he said finally. "Can you get home safe?" "I think so." "Think isn't good enough. Come on, I'll drive you." As they walked back to his truck, a battered Ford that had seen better decades but still ran clean, Maya studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to read a future she couldn't quite imagine. "Will you help us?" she asked, as he opened the passenger door for her. Elias looked down at this brave little girl who'd risked everything on a scrap of paper, and a dead man's word. In the distance, Phoenix sprawled toward the mountains, a city where people disappeared into anonymity every day, but some debts followed you no matter how far you ran. "Yeah, Misha, I'll help." As they drove through the evening traffic toward her neighborhood, Elias was already mentally scrolling through contacts he hadn't called in years, men who'd walked away from the life just like he had, who'd built something decent from the wreckage of their youth. If Camila and Maya were about to face the kind of people who used lawyers and threats instead of fists and bullets, they'd need more than one reformed mechanic's good intentions. They'd need an army. That night, Elias sat in his small apartment above the garage, staring at his phone like it might explode. The numbers were still in his contacts, muscle memory from a lifetime of careful record-keeping. Even after all these years, 3 names that carried 23 years of shared history, survival, mistakes, and the kind of second chances that didn't come twice. Tomas Vega answered on the second ring. "Elias, man, it's been... I need you to come to Phoenix tonight if you can." The line went quiet, except for the sound of children laughing in the background. Tomas's kids, the family he'd built after walking away from everything they'd once known. "What kind of trouble?" Tomas asked, his voice shifting to the careful tone of someone who'd learned to read between lines. "The kind that requires what we used to be good at, but handled the way we do things now. I'll drive down from Flagstaff. Give me 4 hours." Ruben Castillo was harder to reach, working night shift construction, building the high-rise condos that were reshaping Phoenix's skyline. When he finally called back at midnight, Elias could hear the fatigue in his voice. "This about family?" Ruben asked after hearing the basics. "Diego's family. Say no more. I'll be there after my shift ends." Adrian Flores was finishing his last semester of law school at ASU. Studying in the library until it closed, at 26, he was the youngest of their group, but he'd always been the smartest, the one who'd seen the dead end coming before the rest of them had been willing to admit it. "Legal trouble?" Adrian asked, already reaching for a notepad. "The worst kind. Rich people using the system to hurt poor people. My specialty. I'll be there in an hour." By dawn, they were gathered around the small table in Elias's apartment. 4 men who'd once shared the same colors and codes, now wearing the uniforms of their respectable lives. Social worker, electrician, mechanic, law student. The morning light streaming through the single window revealed the changes 2 decades of honest living had wrought. Gray hair, worry lines, the soft spread of men who no longer had to stay ready for violence. But when Elias spread Camila's papers across the table, something familiar flickered in their eyes. The same intelligence that had once kept them alive now focused on documentation that told a story of systematic exploitation. "This is sophisticated," Adrian muttered, scanning contract language with the focused intensity he'd once reserved for reading rival gang territories. Multiple shell companies, accelerated timelines, documentation that looks legitimate but has problems in the fine print. Tomas studied a photograph Maya had taken of the men in suits. "I've seen this pattern before in my casework. They target immigrant families, people without resources to fight back effectively." "How many buildings?" Ruben asked. Maya said at least 3 in her neighborhood, maybe more. Elias's jaw tightened. "And they're using threats about child welfare to keep parents quiet." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic on the interstate. They all knew what that meant. The systematic destruction of families who had no champions. No voices loud enough to matter in courtrooms and city council meetings. "What's the timeline?" Adrian asked. "Days, maybe less. The realtor's pushing hard for immediate compliance." Thomas stood up, already reaching for his keys. "Then we better get started." "Started with what?" Ruben looked skeptical. "We can't exactly roll up to this guy's office like the old days." "No," Elias agreed. "But we can do what we always did best. Gather intelligence, find the weaknesses, and protect the people who can't protect themselves." Adrian was already making notes, his law school training evident in the systematic way he organized information. "We need to understand the full scope of this operation before we can figure out how to stop it. And we need to talk to Camila," Tomas added. "She's going to have to trust us if this is going to work." Elias nodded, thinking about the young woman Diego had loved, now facing the loss of everything she'd built for their daughter. "Let's go introduce ourselves." As they prepared to leave, Ruben caught Elias's arm. "You sure about this, hermano? We've all worked hard to leave that life behind." Elias looked around at his friends, men who'd chosen redemption over revenge, who'd built families and careers from nothing, who still carried the scars of their youth, but wore them like proof of survival, rather than badges of shame. "This isn't about going backward," he said quietly. "This is about using everything we learned to move forward. Diego gave us all a chance when no one else would. Now it's time to pay that forward." Outside, Phoenix was waking up to another day of scorching heat and endless possibility, somewhere in the city. Camila Ortiz was probably getting Maya ready for school, neither of them knowing that help was coming in the form of 4 men who'd once been exactly the kind of people mothers warned their children to avoid. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Camila's hands trembled as she opened the door to find 4 men standing in the building's narrow hallway. For a terrifying moment, she thought the realtor had sent more intimidation. But then the shortest one stepped forward with gentle eyes and a voice that carried genuine warmth. "Mrs. Ortiz, my name is Elias Navarro. Your daughter came to see me yesterday." The recognition hit her like cold water. Maya appeared at her shoulder, suddenly brave again now that her desperate gamble had materialized into actual people. "This is him, Mama. This is Papa's friend." Over coffee that tasted too weak, and conversations that felt too important for their small kitchen. The 4 men listened as Camila spread her story across the scratched table. The documents, the threats, the growing certainty that she was fighting a battle designed to be unwinnable. Adrian studied the paperwork with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned to read legal deception. "These contracts are fraudulent," he said finally. "But they're sophisticated frauds. Whoever's behind this knows exactly how to exploit people who can't afford lawyers." "We need to understand the bigger picture," Thomas said. How many families? How much property? What the ultimate goal is? Reuben was quiet, studying the building around them with the eye of someone who understood how places were built and how they could be torn down. This whole neighborhood's being targeted, isn't it? Camila nodded. Mrs. Garcia upstairs got similar papers last week. The Hernandez family in 2A. Maybe others who are too scared to say anything. Then we need to talk to everyone, Elias said. But carefully. If word gets back to these people that families are organizing, they'll accelerate the timeline, Adrian finished. Make it harder to fight. Over the next 3 days, they moved through the neighborhood like ghosts with good intentions. Thomas, with his social worker credentials, could approach families officially. Reuben, working construction sites across the city, heard rumors from crews hired for mysterious renovation projects that never seemed to involve actual renovation. Adrian haunted the law library and public records office, tracing shell companies and financial connections through a maze designed to obscure rather than clarify. Elias stayed close to Camila and Maya, partly for protection, and partly because seeing the two of them reminded him why this mattered. Maya had her father's fierce determination, but she was still 9 years old, still small enough that the weight of adult terror could crush her if she carried it alone. The picture that emerged was uglier than any of them had expected. At least 7 buildings in the Latino neighborhood, all acquired through the same web of shell companies and fraudulent contracts. Families displaced, businesses forced to close, a systematic dismantling of a community that had taken decades to build. It's not just about profit, Adrian explained during one of their late-night strategy sessions in Elias's apartment. It's about clearing the land for development. These buildings are going to be demolished for luxury condos, so the families lose their homes, and the neighborhood loses its character, Thomas said grimly, and some rich developer gets richer, while hiding behind legal documents that look legitimate to anyone who doesn't know what to look for, Reuben added. Elias stared at the map they'd created, marked with addresses and timelines and the names of families who'd trusted them with their fears. What's our next move? We need more evidence, Adrian said, and we need someone with real legal authority to pay attention. I know someone, Thomas offered. City council member who's been trying to address housing issues, but she'll need solid proof, not just our word. Then we get her solid proof, Elias said. The break came from an unexpected source. Maya, who'd been quiet during most of their adult conversations, suddenly spoke up from her spot at the kitchen table where she'd been doing homework. Mr. Elias, the lady with the fancy car, I think she's been to our building before. What do you mean? Mija, last month when you were at work, Mama, she came with different men. But I saw her from the window. She was taking pictures then, too. Camila's face went pale. Maya, why didn't you tell me? I thought she was just, I don't know, looking at apartments? People look at our building sometimes. Adrian leaned forward. Maya, do you remember anything else about that day? What they were doing? How long they stayed? Maya closed her eyes, concentrating with the intensity of someone who'd learned that details mattered. They had a big camera, and one of the men had a clipboard with drawings on it. Like blueprints, maybe. Blueprints, Reuben repeated slowly. For what? For tearing it down, Elias said grimly. They've been planning this for months. The room fell silent, except for the distant hum of traffic and the soft scratch of Adrian's pen as he added this new information to their growing file. Outside, Phoenix stretched toward the mountains, a city built on reinvention and the promise that anyone could disappear into a new life. But some things, Elias was learning, were worth refusing to let disappear. We need to move faster, he said finally. If they've been planning this for months, we're already behind. Then we catch up, Thomas said simply. Maya looked up from her homework, her small face serious beyond her years. Are you going to save our home? The 4 men exchanged glances, brothers in arms once again, but fighting with briefcases and building codes instead of fists and territory. The stakes felt just as high, maybe higher. We're going to try, Mija, Elias said. We're going to try everything we know how to do. The community center attached to Santa Maria Church had seen better decades, but Father Martinez opened its doors without question when Thomas approached him with careful explanations about housing advocacy and community organizing. The priest, a thin man with gentle eyes and hands stained permanently with ink from mimeograph machines, understood the language of crisis. Use whatever you need, he said simply. This is what the space is for. By 7 p.m. on Thursday, the folding chairs were arranged in uneven rows. and the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the lingering incense from evening mass. Families arrived cautiously, some through the main entrance, others through the side door that led directly from the parking lot. As if keeping escape routes open, Camila sat in the front row with Maya beside her. The girl's homework spread across 2 chairs as she tried to maintain the routine of childhood, while the adults discussed the end of everything familiar. Mrs. Garcia had come, bringing 3 neighbors from different buildings. The Hernandez family sat near the back, their teenage son translating quietly for his grandmother, whose English was limited, but whose understanding of displacement needed no translation. Elias stood at the front, his usually steady hands showing the slightest tremor as he addressed the gathering. Public speaking wasn't in his repertoire of reformed skills, but someone needed to begin. Thank you all for coming. I know this is scary, and I know some of you are taking risks just by being here. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd learned to be heard in difficult circumstances, but we can't fight what's happening to our families if we fight alone. One by one, the stories emerged. Mr. Santos from Camila's building had received similar papers, but hadn't understood them until his nephew, a student at community college, translated the legal language. The Morales family had been given 48 hours to vacate. Their protests met with suggestions that documentation issues might be reviewed if they caused trouble. They're targeting specific buildings, Adrian explained, consulting the notes that had grown into a comprehensive file. All in this neighborhood, all housing families who don't have resources to fight back in court. What can we do? Asked Mrs. Hernandez, her voice heavy with the fatigue of someone who'd been fighting bureaucracy for decades. We're just working people. We can't hire lawyers. You don't need lawyers, Tomas said, stepping forward with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate systems designed to exclude people like them. You need witnesses and documentation and people willing to stand up together. And you need to understand your rights, Adrian added. What they're doing isn't legal, but they're counting on you not knowing that. The conversation that followed was part education, part group therapy, and part tactical planning. Families shared not just their housing situations but their fears, deportation threats, concerns about children's schooling, the exhausting arithmetic of trying to find new homes in a city where rent rose faster than wages. Maya listened to everything with the intensity of someone whose future was being decided in real time, when Mrs. Garcia began crying while describing the 3-generation family that would be separated if they lost their apartment. Maya quietly handed her a tissue from her backpack. What if we all refuse to leave? Suggested Carlos Morales, a young father whose son went to school with Maya. Then they'll start eviction proceedings, Adrian replied. And they'll win eventually, because the contracts they're using are designed to look legitimate in court. So, what's the point of fighting? The question came from the back of the room, voiced by someone Elias couldn't see clearly in the dim lighting. Because, Elias said, his voice gaining strength, they're counting on us to give up without a fight. They're counting on us to be too scared or too tired or too isolated to stand together. He paused, looking around at faces that reflected his own journey, people who'd started with nothing, who'd built something precious from scraps and determination, who now faced the possibility of losing it to forces beyond their control. 25 years ago, someone gave me a chance when I didn't deserve one. Someone vouched for me when no one else would. Someone saw past what I'd been to what I might become. His eyes found Camila's across the room. That person was Maya's father, Diego Ortiz. The room grew quiet, except for the soft hum of the ancient air conditioning unit and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. Diego taught me that protection doesn't come from being stronger than your enemies. It comes from being part of something bigger than yourself. Elias's voice carried now with the weight of hard-won wisdom. These people who want to take your homes, they're strong because they have money and lawyers and systems that work for them. But we're strong because we have each other. Maya stood up suddenly, her small voice cutting through the adult conversation with startling clarity. My papa said that sometimes the only way to beat bullies is to make sure they know you're not alone. The silence that followed was broken by Mrs. Garcia's soft, "Sí, mija, your papa was right." By the time the meeting ended at 9 p.m., they had a plan. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but a plan that gave them something to do besides wait for displacement. They would document everything, contact city officials together, and, if necessary, make their fight public in ways that would be harder for powerful people to ignore, as families filed out into the Phoenix night. Exchanging phone numbers and promises to stay in touch, Maya helped stack the folding chairs with the efficient seriousness of someone who'd been included in adult business and understood the responsibility that came with trust. "Mr. Elias," she said as they prepared to leave, "do you think it will work?" Elias looked down at this brave little girl who'd started everything by following a stranger down a dusty street, with nothing but faith and her father's memory. "I think your papa was right about a lot of things, Mija, including the part about not being alone." The Phoenix City Council chambers at 200 West Washington felt like stepping into a different universe. Marble floors that echoed every footstep, fluorescent lights that bleached the color from everything, air conditioning that turned the August heat into institutional chill. Camila clutched Maya's hand as they climbed the wide steps, both of them dressed in their best clothes. Maya in the dress she wore to church, Camila in the outfit she'd bought for job interviews that never came through. Behind them, families from the neighborhood gathered in nervous clusters. Mrs. Garcia wore her black shoes that pinched but looked respectable. The Hernandez family had brought their teenage son to translate, and he wore his graduation suit. Despite the heat, Mr. Santos carried a folder of documents, his hands shaking slightly with either age or anxiety. "Remember," Adrian coached quietly as they found seats in the public gallery, "keep your statements under 3 minutes. Be specific about what happened, not emotional about how it made you feel." "Easy for him to say," Camila whispered to Maya. Her prepared statement was folded in her purse, practiced dozens of times in their small kitchen, but the words felt fragile in this space designed to make people like her feel small. Elias sat in the row behind them, close enough to be supportive, but far enough away that his presence wouldn't complicate things if anyone recognized him from his previous life. He'd traded his work coveralls for khakis and a button-down shirt that made him look like any other concerned citizen. But Maya could see the tension in his shoulders. "Item 7 on today's agenda," announced Council President Jennifer Walsh, her voice carrying the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing community grievances. "Public comment period regarding housing concerns in the Garfield neighborhood." The developer's representatives went first. Nolan Pierce himself, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than Camila made in 6 months, spoke about economic development and neighborhood revitalization with the smooth confidence of someone who'd given this presentation many times before. "The Garfield area has tremendous potential," he said, consulting notes he didn't really need. "These improvements will bring jobs, increase property values, and create housing opportunities that meet contemporary standards." Camila listened to him turn their displacement into economic opportunity, their lost homes into progress. The language was clean and professional, scrubbed of any reference to actual people who would be affected by this revitalization. Then it was their turn. Mrs. Garcia went first, her voice trembling but clear as she described 60 years of residency in the neighborhood, 3 generations raised in the same building, the impossibility of finding comparable housing on her fixed income. Her English was accented but precise, and she spoke directly to the council members as if they were neighbors rather than officials. The Hernandez family followed. Their son, translating as his grandmother, described the community garden behind their building, how she'd taught neighborhood children to grow vegetables that reminded them of Mexico, how displacement would scatter not just families but the informal networks of childcare and elder support that kept everyone afloat. When Camila's turn came, her legs felt unsteady as she approached the microphone. The bright lights made it impossible to see individual faces in the gallery, but she could sense Maya watching, and that was enough. "My name is Camila Ortiz," she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I work at Murphy's Diner on Central Avenue. I'm a single mother raising my daughter in the neighborhood where my partner died trying to help someone else." She told their story simply. The men in suits, the documents she couldn't understand, the threats about social services that kept her awake at night. She spoke about Maya's school, about the neighbors who looked after each other, about the impossibility of finding another home they could afford in a city where rents rose faster than wages. "These aren't just buildings to us," she said, looking directly at the council members. "They're our community, our safety net, our children's stability. When you displace families like mine, you're not just changing addresses, you're destroying the connections that help us survive." The 3 minutes felt both endless and insufficient. As she returned to her seat, Maya squeezed her hand, and Camila realized she'd managed to say everything that mattered without crying. Adrian went last, presenting the legal analysis in language calibrated for elected officials who needed to understand liability, fraudulent contracts, violations of tenant rights, systematic targeting of immigrant families. He laid it out like a prosecutor building a case, complete with documentation and precedent. This isn't about opposing development, he concluded. It's about ensuring that development happens legally, ethically, and with proper consideration for existing residents' rights. The council deliberated for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Camila watched their faces for clues, trying to read the political calculations behind expressions of concern and questions about jurisdiction. Finally, Council President Walsh leaned into her microphone. Based on the testimony we've heard today and the documentation provided, we're directing the city attorney's office to investigate the contract and acquisition procedures described by these residents. Additionally, we're implementing an immediate moratorium on evictions in the affected buildings pending resolution of these concerns. The gallery erupted in quiet celebration, applause that was restrained by the formal setting but genuine in its relief. Maya bounced in her seat, and Mrs. Garcia dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. But Camila, looking at Nolan Pierce's face as he conferred with his lawyers, knew this was only the beginning. Men like him didn't give up easily, and they had resources beyond her imagination. Still, for the first time in weeks, she felt like they might have a chance. The investigation moved with the deliberate pace of municipal government, but its effects rippled through the neighborhood immediately. Eviction notices stopped arriving. The men in suits disappeared. The realtor's BMW no longer cruised slowly past the buildings, photographing residents who dared to maintain their normal routines. "It's too quiet," Elias said during one of their evening strategy sessions in Camila's kitchen. "People like Pierce don't just give up because of one city council meeting." He was right. 3 days later, the counterattack began. It started with anonymous calls to immigration services, reporting suspicious documentation in the neighborhood, then health department inspections that seemed designed to find violations rather than ensure safety. Building code officials appeared with clipboards and cameras, measuring clearances and checking permits with unusual scrutiny. "They can't attack the families directly anymore," Adrian explained grimly. "So they're trying to make the buildings uninhabitable through regulatory pressure." Maya watched her mother's stress rebuild like monsoon clouds gathering on the horizon. Camila started checking locks twice, jumping at unexpected sounds, studying every official-looking letter with the paranoid intensity of someone who'd learned that authority could arrive in many forms. But something else was building alongside the pressure. The neighborhood had tasted solidarity and found it more nourishing than fear. Mrs. Garcia organized phone trees to share information about inspections. The Hernandez family set up a documentation system, photographing every interaction with officials. Young Carlos Morales started a group chat that kept families connected in real time. "They're trying to divide us again," Tomas observed during a community meeting in Father Martinez's social hall. "Make us suspicious of each other. Make us feel isolated and vulnerable. Then we do the opposite," said Mrs. Garcia, her voice carrying new authority. "We stay together. We share everything. We make sure nobody faces this alone." Maya had been quiet during most of these adult conversations, but she'd been thinking with the clarity that sometimes comes from being too young to understand why things should be impossible. "Mr. Elias," she said during a lull in the discussion, "what if we invited the reporter to come see our neighborhood? The one who wrote about the city council meeting." "What do you mean, Misha?" "Well, they keep saying our buildings are dangerous and our families cause problems, but that's not true. What if the reporter came and saw what it's really like? Saw Mrs. Garcia's garden, and the kids playing soccer in the courtyard, and how everyone looks after each other?" The adults exchanged glances. Sometimes the most obvious solutions required a child's perspective to become visible. "That's actually not a bad idea," Adrian said slowly. "Community organizing isn't just about fighting back. It's also about changing the narrative." The reporter from the Phoenix New Times was a young woman named Sarah Chen, who'd covered housing issues before. When she arrived the following Saturday morning with a camera and genuine curiosity, she found a neighborhood that defied every stereotype about troubled housing that the developers had been promoting. She photographed Mrs. Garcia, teaching Maya and other children to identify tomato plants ready for harvest. She interviewed Mr. Santos about the murals he'd painted in the courtyard, images of desert landscapes and family celebrations that transformed concrete walls into community art. She documented the informal economy that kept families afloat. Senora Morales's tamale business run from her kitchen, the mechanic shop where teenagers learned job skills alongside automotive repair, the music lessons that happened in living rooms every Tuesday evening. "This isn't what I expected," Sarah admitted to Camila, as Maya showed her the reading corner in the building's lobby, where donated books in English and Spanish created an impromptu library. "What did you expect?" Based on the official reports, Overcrowding, code violations, families who didn't take care of their environment. Sarah looked around at children playing games that required both languages, elderly residents teaching young mothers traditional recipes, teenagers helping with homework while their parents worked evening shifts. This is a functional community. It's our home, Camila said simply. When the article appeared 3 days later, it told a story that complicated the simple narrative of urban development. Fighting for home, a Phoenix neighborhood resists displacement, presented the families not as obstacles to progress, but as people with legitimate claims to the spaces they'd invested their lives in building. The piece included photos of Maya doing homework at the kitchen table where her parents had once planned their future. Mrs. Garcia's hands gentle on tomato plants that had been growing in recycled containers for 3 seasons. Elias teaching young men to change brake pads in a garage bay where second chances had been growing for over 20 years. It also included a response from Nolan Pierce's office, professional language about economic development and housing standards that sounded hollow against the documented reality of community resilience. The article changed something fundamental about their fight. Suddenly, they weren't just resisting displacement. They were representing values that resonated beyond their neighborhood. Phone calls started coming from other communities facing similar pressures. A law professor at ASU reached out to Adrian about pro bono representation. City council members who'd been non-committal began asking for updates. We're not just fighting for our homes anymore, Elias realized during another evening meeting. We're fighting for the idea that communities matter more than profits. Maya, coloring at the edge of the conversation, while adults talked about legal strategies and political pressure, looked up with the matter-of-fact wisdom that still surprised everyone. Papa always said that when you stand up for what's right, other people start standing up too. Outside their window, Phoenix stretched toward mountains that had watched communities rise and fall for centuries. But this community, built from hope and sustained by mutual aid, had decided it wasn't finished rising yet. 6 months later, the courtyard of Camila's building buzzed with the controlled chaos of celebration. Folding tables borrowed from Santa Maria Church groaned under dishes that represented 3 generations of family recipes, while children darted between lawn chairs and adults armed with paper plates. String lights borrowed from Reuben's construction site crew created warm pools of light that turned the utilitarian space into something magical. Maya moved through the party with the confidence of someone who'd learned that communities could survive existential threats, carrying messages between groups of adults and making sure elderly neighbors had enough to eat. She wore the San Judas pendant openly now, its silver surface polished until it caught the light, at one of the tables. Adrian spread legal documents that told a very different story than the ones Camila had faced 9 months earlier. The investigation prompted by their city council testimony had uncovered a pattern of fraud extensive enough to trigger federal attention. Nolan Pierce's development company faced charges that would likely end his career, and possibly his freedom. 17 buildings total, Adrian explained to a small group that included Sarah Chen, the reporter whose coverage had amplified their story beyond Phoenix. All acquired through fraudulent contracts, all targeting immigrant families who didn't have resources to fight back effectively. What happens to the families now? Sarah asked. The buildings have been acquired by a nonprofit housing organization, Tomas said, consulting notes from his new position as community liaison. Rent stabilized, resident managed, with support services for families who need them. Mrs. Garcia, resplendent in a dress she'd been saving for special occasions, held court near the tamale table, describing the victory to relatives who'd driven down from Tucson to see what all the excitement was about. Her English had become more confident over the months of advocacy, and she switched between languages with the fluidity of someone who'd learned that being bilingual was an asset rather than a limitation. We scared them, she laughed, accepting congratulations from a niece who worked for a civil rights organization. A bunch of working people with folding chairs and borrowed lawyers. We scared people who thought money made them invincible. Elias stood slightly apart from the main celebration, watching the community he'd helped save continue the patient work of being a community. His garage had become an unofficial headquarters for organizing efforts that had spread beyond their neighborhood, and he'd discovered a talent for teaching both automotive repair and civic engagement to young people who needed practical skills and political awareness in equal measure. You did good, hermano, Reuben said, approaching with 2 plates loaded with food. Diego would be proud. We all did good. Elias accepted the plate, but kept watching Maya, who was showing a group of younger children how to play a clapping game that required counting in 2 languages. But especially that kid. None of this happens if she doesn't decide to follow a stranger down the street. Think she knows what she started. Before Elias could answer, Maya appeared at his elbow with the suddenly serious expression that meant she had something important to say. Mr. Elias, my mama wants to know if you'll help her hang Papa's picture in the new community room. The community room had been one of the improvements negotiated as part of the settlement, a space where residents could hold meetings, children could do homework, and families could gather for celebrations exactly like this one. Diego's photograph, professionally reprinted and framed, would hang alongside images of other community members who'd contributed to the neighborhood's resilience. Of course, mija. As they walked toward the building's entrance, Maya slipped her hand into his with the casual trust of someone who'd learned that some adults could be counted on, even when everything else felt uncertain. Mr. Elias, are there other neighborhoods like ours? Places where people need help like we did? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Maya had watched her community organize, fight, and win, but she'd also seen how close they'd come to losing everything. Her 9-year-old understanding of justice had expanded to include awareness that their victory was meaningful, partly because it was unusual. Yeah, mija, there are. Will you help them too? Elias stopped walking and knelt down to her level, the way he had that first afternoon when she'd shown him the paper with Lobo 27, written in her father's careful handwriting. Around them, the sounds of celebration continued, laughter and conversations in multiple languages, children playing games that had been played in this courtyard for decades, adults making plans for a future that felt possible rather than precarious. You know what your papa taught me, Maya. He taught me that protection isn't something you do once, and then you're finished. It's something you do every day, for as long as you're able. Maya nodded with the gravity of someone who understood that some promises were meant to last a lifetime. Then yes, Elias continued, we'll help whoever needs help. All of us. Together. As they resumed walking toward the building, the sounds of community celebration echoed off the walls, like a promise made of music and shared food and the kind of hope that survives because it's built from small acts of courage compounded over time. In the distance, Phoenix stretched toward mountains that had watched countless communities rise and fall. But this community, strengthened by struggle and sustained by the knowledge that they could protect each other, had written itself into the permanent story of home. Stories like this remind us that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they stand together. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask for help. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is answer when someone asks. Every community has the potential for this kind of solidarity and resilience. What matters is recognizing that our individual struggles are often connected to larger patterns, and that collective action can transform what seems impossible into what becomes inevitable. Would you like another story?